Okay, so the Brits definitely came to India and started to take over and make changes to things that they didn't like. I mean, that's their MO. It's what they did. They're all of their colonies. Um, English was taught in schools. There's several languages spoken in India today, but English is definitely one of them because, of course, English is the superior language. It's the language of the Brits, and they're the ones who have, the sun never set on their British Empire. So, of course, English is the best language, product of social Darwinism, if you will. They did not care for the caste system. They just felt it was uncivilized, this whole you're stuck where you're born. I mean, truly, in a capitalist society, if you're born poor, the odds are you're going to stay poor, but the hope for opportunity and the hope for betterment, and then some people do, like you will have success stories of, people who are self-made, and like you have that all throughout the capitalist world. And in the caste system, you can't, and my screen just went blank. But now it's back, so here we go. So one of the things that the Brits do is what they do best. They divide and conquer, right? They play rivals off of each other, and they get the untouchables to be like, you can improve your lives with us, and this whole being stuck where you are and having these horrible jobs, you can change that. There's hope with us. And the Brits were positively disgusted by the practice of sati. They just found it to be brutally barbaric, completely. Just how can you force? They're forcibly burning their women on their husband's funeral pyre, and it's funny if you think back to like the Inquisition in England, when like with Bloody Mary, and then like what Elizabeth does with the Catholics. It's like they have their own history of absolutely brutal treatment, but if they felt it was uncivilized, then it was uncivilized. So they forcibly end the practice of sati, and they allow Hindu women to remarry, which is a huge deal because Hindu women, of course, you remember from last year, they couldn't remarry. So they're making changes politically and also culturally, and this is a big deal because when you start to mess with people's religions, it doesn't sit well with the masses. I mean, some people, a lot of women might have been like, woohoo, no more sati, and we can remarry. Like they might have found that to be a fair practice, and we all think, well, thank God they ended sati, and of course they should be remarried. But that's our mindset. That's what we're used to. And of course, when you have a different culture, to make changes to that, even if we feel it's better, it's still changing one's culture. So it was a tricky thing. So not all Indians accepted all these changes, and some perceived as attacks on their culture. And the sepoys, these Indian soldiers, the Brits definitely continued to push forth the Western culture on them, and they would make them do certain things just honestly because the Brits, because they could. And that's just, we're going to have lots of instances of that when we talk about British rule over their empire. So sepoys are Indian soldiers that the British military accepted, and they were Indians fighting with the British army. And this was a common practice done by the Brits because they didn't send an entire, invasion military to go into India. They went with their small resources and they divided and conquered. They played off the rivalries off each other, very similarly as the Guptas did, as the Mughals did, because if you remember back, India is made up of regional provinces, and we think of it as the subcontinent of India as one entity, but it wasn't like that. Regionalism was really big in play. So the Brits used that to their advantage, as they will throughout their empire. And so in some of the things that the Brits did to the sepoys couldn't, they would say, okay, well, you're part of the British military, you need to go to Australia, or you need to go to other places where the British controlled, and that kind of went against caste rules and caste teachings, and the Brits didn't really seem to care because this wasn't, their culture. The sepoys needed to conform. Another thing that they did was they decided to cover the casings of the gunpowder. To waterproof them, they covered them in fat. And instead of using a vegetable fat or a controversial fat, they decided to use cow and pig fat. And you might remember that cows are sacred, to Hindus, and pigs are unclean to Muslims. And the large population of sepoys were Hindu or Muslim. So they had to bite the bullet. They had to bite off the top of the cartridge to pour the gunpowder into the top of their rifle. And so when they're doing that, they're ingesting this fat. And so they're either ingesting a sacred animal or an unclean animal. And that was just kind of the straw that broke them. The sepoys, rose up. They attacked British posts. They killed British men, women, and children. It was definitely an attack. Some could call it a massacre, but truly was a rebellion. They were fighting against this oppressive regime. And of course, the Brits responded back in full force, and they killed even more Indian men, women, and children, and the Brits just squashed the sepoys. There was anytime you use force against the British Empire, it didn't always work out, which is why Gandhi, chose his method of nonviolence and saw success. So the sepoys that were not killed during the rebellion, if you look at the bottom right-hand picture, that was actually a common way that the Brits would execute Indians or sepoys. They would tie them to a cannon, and then they would fire the cannon. So a cannonball would go through you, at direct impact, and that was a very common way to execute and make a demonstration of don't screw with the British Empire. And so what the Brits had to do, they kind of changed their approach. I mean, they squashed the rebellion, they made their point, but then they realized, all right, maybe we shouldn't use cow and pig fat. And they did change that after they executed everybody, who led the rebellion. And then they tried to do that whole re-education thing of sepoys and Indians because they had to reestablish that hegemony, right? Order and authority only works if your peoples validate the authority and order that the government is providing. So that rebellion led to chaos and disorder, and hegemony needed to be reestablished. Okay, so this is where Mrs. Villegas' lesson picks up. And I will let her take it from there. If you have any questions, write them down. We will be going over them next week. Have a happy Thanksgiving.